Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Well, Nick, thank you so much. I know we have a ton of questions. And again, when I have screen share going, I can't look into chat to view any of them. I should apologize. I'm getting a little bit used to using PowerPoint with Zoom. So that's my shortcoming. But let me see who, well, Gary Stevenson had his hand open. Gary, would you like to go?
Fantastic briefing. Thanks much, Nick. I have three questions I put in the chat. First is your reaction, if any, to Frank Milburn's report that was recently released. I think looks to me like he's even in attendance today, so he might also be intrigued by your reaction to that. Second would be your reactions to Hal Puthoff's AATIP Reveal talk, which came out in June of 2018. Third, reaction, if any, to the Estes Park Advanced Propulsion Conference. I'd be interested in your thoughts on those three.
Well, with apologies, I think I missed the first, but if Frank's here, we'll hand the floor to.
That was the first one, right?
Yeah.
What's your reaction? Have you read the Milburn report, and what's your reaction?
No, I have not read it. I know I should have done, I'm sure. I tend to think that there are so many deep specialists with the science in all this that a lot will go over my head. But we can come back to that. I did. Now, Hal Puthoff's talk and presentation, was that an SCU event?
It may have been. I don't know.
Was it at Huntingdon or?
I don't know what the source was, and when it was put up on YouTube, it wasn't well sourced.
Right. I think that might have been a Scientific Coalition on Ufology talk done at either Huntsville or Huntingdon, something like that. I did listen and read to that, and the third one I did not. This was the advanced propulsion one, right?
I think Tim Ventura has a link that we could get to that one. But that's more technical. I think the nice thing about the Milburn report, which I believe Frank has like a 2-hour walkthrough on YouTube. I don't have a link to that, but that also was a very fantastic watch because it really brought it to life, in terms of what's new in that report.
Well, why don't I do this then? Frank is here, so why don't I do ask to unmute? And if he's been here since actually the very beginning, so if he's in front of his computer listening still.
Yeah, hi guys. Is sound okay for everybody?
Wonderful. Thank you, Frank.
Great, sure. What are the questions? What would you like me to answer?
Well, really, because I don't believe that I have read your report, if you could just give a brief overview of it and as much for me as anything else. Now, and I apologize. It may be that I have read it. I have read an awful lot and seen a lot of presentations on this, and sometimes I just, with apologies, I just forget or I conflate somebody's presentation with somebody else's.
No, not a problem at all. I mean, my background, the way I came at it, I'm a former UK military intelligence officer. So I worked across the board with SF, with Royal Navy, Royal Air Force, Army. So I was really interested in the threat aspect of it, coming from that background, and I got in contact with people like Jack Sarfati for the kind of technical background, Eric Davis, and also John Alexander, seeing as he had very extensive background in the Pentagon and obviously the requisite military background. So my paper really was trying, the purpose behind the paper, the kind of mission statement, I guess, was to bring where we are kind of with UAP at the moment and the more recent revelations of the last 3 years. It was to bring that into the academic world and especially into the kind of like the war studies, strategic studies world where I've been published before, because I felt, well, these guys aren't looking at, and they should be. If you're talking about a post-quantum leap in technologies, you know, when I was a young officer at Sandhurst, you know, they were talking in the early 90s, they were talking about, you know, the revolution in military affairs. So if we're now looking at, you know, what Jack Sarfati calls T cubed, you know, tic tac tech, and these DIA papers that are looking sort of, you know, 40 years into the future, effectively that's a post-quantum leap in military affairs, and that's what I wanted to look at. But also as well in the paper I wanted to look at you know, some of the declassified reports like Condyne, and I've got a question for you, Nick, on that as well. And I wanted to look at some of the literature looking at, you know, like potential like UFO, UFO weaponry and technology, going back, you know, to the 1960s, people who were, you know, credible, you know, NASA aeronautical engineers, people with those kind of backgrounds, and to look at the literature behind it and to touch on that and to bring that into the academic world, because I felt this is an area that nobody really had looked at. So that's basically it in a nutshell.
Well, firstly, my profuse apologies. Clearly, I absolutely should have read your paper, and I don't know how. I mean, maybe the good news is maybe I'll read it and say, "Oh yes, that one." Now, and hopefully, what I said. Now, I don't know whether my terminology is either out of date or whether now I live in the US, there's different terminology. But hopefully, you recognized what I was talking about: capability times intent, defining threat. Is that something that you used in your war studies?
Well, very much so. Yeah, I mean, when Luis Elizondo was kind of repeatedly talking about, you know, capability plus threat. I mean, that's all what you'd sort of call, you know, my stock in trade from my own background. You know, you're looking at capabilities, intentions, you know, combat effectiveness, organization, intentions, locations, all the rest of it. The thing that I find interesting is that it's very difficult to pin down what you know, the intentions of these intelligences behind these craft may be, because first of all you've got to pin down, well, who are they or what are they? And it seems to me that there's a hell of a lot of different descriptions of different craft, maybe having very similar technology, but there's a hell of a lot of different descriptions of craft, and also there's a massive variation in terms of description of the occupants of those craft as well. So, you know, whether people say, oh yes, well, you know, Space Brothers, they're here to help us, or other people say, well, they are aligned. Well, who's they? Because there seems to be a lot of different theys.
Yes, and of course, I think people like you and myself and Lou Elizondo and others, we probably upset what I would call the sort of new age spiritual side of the UFO community when we start talking about capability, intent, and threat. But as you were saying, that's simply hardwired into us as the way that we define all of this. But I want to pick up on one point which will tie in. You mentioned these sorts of look forwards. As you know, and you've probably read it, maybe you contributed it to even, I don't know. But the UK government, and specifically the Ministry of Defence, sponsors something called the Global Strategic Trends Program. And some of that is published. And the great thing about global strategic trends is, as you know, it's a look forward about 30 years on the basis that, generally speaking, 30 years is what most people will tell you is a reasonable length of time to make predictions before they start to, too many variables come in and they break down. So when the DoD said that AATIP was really just looking at next generation aerospace threats, well, fortunately, we know from global strategic trends what a sort of next generation look forward into those sorts of technologies look like. And it doesn't look anything like AATIP.
I agree very much. In the paper, I actually quote a lot of previously unpublished correspondence by permission between so Jack Sarfati, Eric Davis, the whole load of other physicists and people with intelligence backgrounds and other backgrounds on this kind of email trail. And Eric Davis is very adamant. He's saying, well, yeah, we were basically, you know, what happens if these intelligences behind these UFOs, you know, start to decide that they're going to be hostile? And he said, some of the cases, like in Brazil, Colares, shutting down, the nuclear bases in the northern tier, causing problems for, the strategic assets. He said, well, that's not, friendly behavior. So he was very specifically saying, yes, we're looking at these technologies because we want to have this technology if Tic Tac has it. So not just for looking at, adversaries on the terrestrial sphere, shall we say.
Sure. And you mentioned Project Condign. I should just, before I take your question on Condign, which I hope I can answer, I should just, for those that don't know, in the 90s, the Ministry of Defense commissioned a study into UAP, which was supposed to be something not just, previously when we looked at this, it's just investigating on a case-by-case basis. The feeling was that we had never done a proper intelligence assessment of the phenomenon. We'd never really done any proper trend analysis. The feeling was that we needed something. It went through a number of different incarnations and plans, and by the time it got off the ground, I'd moved on. But for those not familiar, Project Condign is the colloquial name for a study and a report known as Unidentified Aerial Phenomena in the United Kingdom Air Defense Region. And I think it ended up going, frankly, it did some good work, but I think it like a lot of these highly classified, deeply compartmentalized programs, where one person plays a disproportionate role, it went up going down a little bit of a rabbit hole about an atmospheric plasma phenomenon. I think, as a layperson, it made the mistake of trying to explain one unidentified, misunderstood phenomenon in terms of another. But it is what it is, and it certainly talked about the possibility of deriving, the term that was used was novel military technologies, quote unquote, including things like directed energy weapons, RF weapons, and signature reduction, etc. And there is an interesting crossover, I think, between Project Condign's final report, some of the things that came out in the Propulsion conference I mentioned from 2001, and one or two of the things that have come up in the AATIP program. But those dots, I think, have yet to be fully joined. But if you have a question on Project Condign, I will do my best to answer.
Actually, Nick, let me jump in. Jeremy Reese has been patiently waiting, and he is doing the YouTube live stream. So, Jeremy, did you have a question, or was it from some of the YouTube folks?
Let me unmute myself. I had a question for Nick first. It was regarding your comments on AATIP and the fact that there was this other private organization called Bigelow Aerospace that was heavily involved. And you had quickly mentioned about the intelligence advantages of using a private corporation as opposed to keeping these programs within the government where they're accessible by FOIA, and that we brought up a lot of good points about those 38 papers that you'd mentioned that Stephen Aftergood had gotten through that FOIA that he filed, which show that these studies went beyond just aerospace. And they went into a whole variety of different programs. And in fact, I have a lot more than 38 papers from some of those, from some of those authors and some of the scientists on that list. As many people in this chat are aware that they've been involved in much more than just those programs that are on that list. But my question regarding Bigelow and AATIP was specifically, I wanted to know, like the Pentagon Memorandum. Have you heard of the Pentagon Memorandum before?
It rings a bell, but you'll have to refresh my memory.
So while Jack Valet was going through J. Allen Hynek's archives from Project Bloom book, he came across a very interesting memorandum which talked of, that there was another private organization that was sort of involved with the UFO research in order to keep a lot of this information out of the whole UFO file out of the hands of everyone in the government. And that organization was called Battelle. Battelle runs all of our national laboratories for science, and they have for many years. It would be the perfect organization to have hid these sort of programs under, just like you were mentioning with Bigelow. And this organization, of course, goes back to the 1920s and 30s. It predates the CIA, it predates Roswell, and a lot of this stuff. So, and they did a lot of work on the Manhattan Project as well. So I've come across them in my research, including a number of metallurgists who say that they worked on materials for Battelle. So I was just interested if you could tell us anything about that.
Well, I think with all of this, joining the dots is the challenge, and it's certainly fascinating that Battelle comes up. Battelle came up the other day, actually. Somebody asked me, and I think this actually ties in with Project Condign. One of the things mentioned in Project Condign was RF weapons, directed energy weapons, etc. But also, I think, non-lethal weapons and opportunities there. Then I think there's a fascinating, I don't even know how to unpack this. John Burroughs, one of the witnesses to the infamous Rendlesham Forest incident, John made a Freedom of Information Act request, and he turned up a DSTL document from the UK, Defence Science and Technology Laboratories, or whatever they call themselves, that was inspired by a Battelle paper. And they got into, I think the paper was about plasma vortices and plasma guns. And I have a short paper on that from DSTL that I can pass to anyone that's interested in it. But yeah, the same names come up again and again. I mean, just as a complete aside, I happen to be reading at the moment the book about the links between 60s counterculture and the birth of the personal computing industry, what the Dormouse said. And who should I stumble across mentioned there but Jacques Vallée, which I was not expecting to find. But yeah, always these connections.
It's another interesting connection that one of the fathers of the modern computer, John von Neumann, published a paper in 1947 on self-replicating space probes.
Yes, I'm familiar with that one.
Yeah, thank you for that. Very, very good connections we're drawing here. Thank you so much for joining us and answering our questions.
Wonderful. Well, so let me see, and I should apologize for being behind on the questions. Robert O'Keefe, he had said that he has a question. Robert, are you there? There we go. Let me ask him to unmute.
There we go. Hey, Ned. Nice to meet you. I'm the founder and CEO of Tachyon Aerospace. We're based out of London. We're with the, we're involved with the ESA and the ISA and a bunch of other aerospace organisations. We was asked, we were guest speakers at an aerospace conference a couple of years ago with NASA. Sorry, hang on. Let me just stop that. Sorry about that. Incoming call. Yeah, we were asked to be guest speakers at an aerospace conference with NASA, Airbus, and a bunch of other well-known companies. And during dinner, we were sat talking with the people from NASA, and we talked, like, in the industry, when you say technology that we've got flying now is 20 years ahead. It is generally like in the industry known, but we're probably 30, 40 years ahead to what the public are made aware of. As of to the US slide talking about the Navy, do you not think that that's not a Magic Wand project where they're trying to create some disinformation to go out to the public, so the public are watching like the wrong hand while they're investigating like the real phenomena that's going on?
It could well be. And I think I mentioned that as the second of the theories, that this whole thing, or part of it, a large part of it, could indeed be an intelligence operation to distract people from something else, to perhaps imply the existence of a capability that doesn't exist. I think that, and I don't know if he's here, is it David Hambling wrote an interesting article, was it in Forbes recently, where he talked about laser plasmas and such like. You know, that's, I guess, something else to go into the pot. Then there's the whole idea of spoofing. And if we could spoof an air defense system, an entire air defense network, to think something's coming from one direction and then come in from the other. Obviously, the military examples are immense. And this, of course, goes back to, what was it called, Palladium and other programs like that. But if that was then, as you say, where are we now? And you're quite right. And I think it depends who you ask. Some people will tell you, will say, yeah, 40, 50 years. Some people say 15, 20. I think everyone's got their own opinion, and there's probably no one single answer. It probably depends on the very specific field. But thank you for that.
I think one of the important things, though, is one of the comments which was made by NASA was that in the industry today, if you are and this is interesting because of what we've got flying now, and like the unknown, like the UFO side as well, but what we've got flying now, NASA absolutely categorically state that if you are 10 years ahead, you're considered crazy. So this is relevant for all of us that work on like alternative technology and new physics and science. So the big players in the industry consider you crazy if you're 10 years ahead of currently what the public are aware of. If you're a year ahead, then you're still considered to be bleeding edge. But if you're only 3-4 months ahead of the technology, which taking into account that they're 30, 40 years ahead, and we play the game that if you're 3 months ahead, then they tend to be happy to look at what you're doing, knowing that you're not a threat to them as an industry. And they stated that it would be, and this was asked by one of our team members. I was a guest speaker at the conference, but one of our company members asked a question of the NASA representative about this, and they stated if you're 3 months ahead, then you're considered to be feasible. And he he talked himself into a bit of a situation.
Right.
So,
no, thank you for that. And by the way, just backpedaling to something I mentioned earlier, I think I got a little tongue-tied on a couple of things. The government weapons scientist that I was talking about was Dr. David Kelly, and I also mentioned the interface between Bigelow Aerospace and the DIA on the AATIP program, and I mean the point that I was wanting to make, but I just I think stumbled my words. What I was looking for in terms of the interface between private sector and government is the contracting officer and the contracting officer's representative. and those are the two key figures in keeping all this on time and on target, and not allowing the contractor to go down any sort of personal hobby horses and rabbit holes and things. And I think it was James Latatsky, mangling my pronunciations again, I apologize, who was one of the key players there with AATIP. Again, it's in the paperwork, I believe, the contractual solicitation documentation. But thank you for that, Robert.
And thank you as well, Nick. So Eric Hermanson had asked, from an engineering perspective, he said he was wondering if you believe, if there's any certainty or certainly not, I think he's asking, if the US or UK is in possession of any kind of off-world engineered vehicle. Do you think that that's the case or not? And if so, I guess he was wondering about, is that something that could be used to engineer new technologies?
The short answer is I don't know. My best answer so far as my time in the Ministry of Defense is concerned is that we did not have any such materials, artifacts, or anything in the UK. I can't speak to the position of the US government with any inside knowledge at all. I can only, I suppose, pick up on the speculation that has arisen as a result of people talking about these so-called metamaterials. Now, whether, I mean, to me, this is where, well, I don't know if there are any chemists here today, but my one little piece of layperson science knowledge here is to say that in one sense, with X-ray diffraction and isotopic ratio analysis, those sorts of tests on any anomalous materials are so obvious and so almost high school or first year college kind of chemistry that it's inconceivable to me that they wouldn't have been run on pretty much day one of any serious look at any materials. So while my answer is that I don't know what the US government has on this, my comment is that if they do have something, a couple of tests will very quickly tell them in a completely binary yes-no way whether there's anything interesting or and unusual about this or not. And with that in mind, it does strike me as interesting that the US Army, and I think it was Materials Command, whatever they call themselves, entered into a CRADA, one of these collaborative research and development agreements with the To the Stars Academy on this. Why would they be entering into a CRADA? Well, you could say nothing much to lose, a lot to gain. Is it just classic low probability, high impact? Well, yes, except that you would have expected them to ask the questions and maybe at least satisfy themselves on something like isotopic ratio analysis before they even got to that stage. So it's the US Army CRADA with TTSA is one of the more interesting things, I think, in terms of the science of all this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nick. And let me actually, Frank has had his hand up. So let me go back to Frank then. Sir?
Thanks very much. Nick, I wanted to get your take, please, on something out of Condyne. I actually mentioned it in my report. In Condyne, they reference the former Soviet Union, and they've got this Russian source, Sokolov, and he's saying, I quote, "We had 40 cases where pilots encountered UFOs, blah, blah, blah. Initially, they were commanded to chase, then shoot. When our pilots would engage, the UFO would speed up. Then it said that happened 3 times, twice the pilots died. After that, we told the pilots to observe and change course and get out. The pilots viewed UFOs as a definite threat." And then it goes on to say the military, that's the Soviet military, were interested in UFOs because if they could understand the technology behind them, then they could win the competition against prospective enemies. The point that I've got is, if you've got DI, a Defense Intelligence 55 report that's talking about the Soviet Air Force, which is effectively the principal adversary to both the UK and the US. So if the Russians, the Soviets, if they're concerned about UFOs being a threat, would the Royal Air Force and the United States Air Force not consider UFOs to be a threat?
They should, but as you probably know better than anyone, Project Condign was kept on such close hold that I'm not sure this ever got briefed to the RAF more generally. Indeed, I think with some aspects of the study, when the intelligence officer who was doing it went to talk to some of the radar people, I think they said they misrepresented the position as we're just doing a study into radar anomalies and flight safety or something like that. So the number of people, I mean, the short answer to the question is no, they weren't briefed, but they should have been. But of course, it's the same. I think the reason why so many opportunities were missed in Project Condign was that there wasn't proper stakeholder identification and engagement. I mean, I've done a couple of studies where I was team leader and deputy team leader, nothing to do with UFOs, but I know the methodology of an MOD study. One of the first things you do is you identify all your stakeholders and all the subject matter experts, and you make sure you go and talk to them. None of this happened in Project Condign. So, I know why, of course. I mean, it's not the first time it happens. It happens all the time. It's just, I would say, it's one of the more generic failures of specific intelligence community studies more generally. But it's incredibly frustrating.
Thank you very much for that.
Sorry, I'm still muted. Now, does anyone else have any questions for Nick? Or should I say who has a question next? Because there are so many that have been floating around. And now suddenly it's quiet.
Let me just interject on one point. I've seen a couple of people say that they want to get in touch with me. My website, my email address is contact@nickpope.net. That will get to me personally. So if anyone wants to reach out, whether it's for copies of any of the documents that I've mentioned, like the contractual solicitation or whatever it is, the Harry Reid letter. I mean, most of you have probably seen those anyway, but for those that haven't, I'll do my best. Obviously, I do get somewhat swamped with emails because that's a sort of email address on my public website, and I get a lot. So, but I will, if anyone wants to ask anything or request anything, contact@nickpope.net, and I will try to get back to you. It's a very busy time at the moment because there's a lot of stories I'm working on in relation to this, but I will do my best.
Wonderful. Okay, now let me see, Mark Fiorentino. Mark, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? It looks like he was asking about the government using disinformation tactics, but I'd like him to be able to ask it in person if I can.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I was just wondering if you knew that, has the government tried to block us from realizing that magnetism has something to do with that anti-gravity and is the method of propulsion for their craft?
I don't know is the short answer to that. I mean, I think in relation to the UFO phenomenon more generally, the government, I would venture to say the government has seldom needed to use disinformation because frankly, there's so much kind of crazy stuff that gets tagged onto this subject that they haven't needed to. If ever you wanted to bury something amidst kind of crazy theories. There's no need for the government to put out crazy theories. Enough such theories are coming in all the time, and the government wouldn't need to. I think the one or two occasions where the government has literally, shall we say, stepped in to maybe throw gasoline on a particular fire has been the occasions where, for example, things like the SR-71 Blackbird and the U-2 were seen by pilots and maybe were going to get reported in such a way as it might have attracted the attention of the air attaché in the Soviet embassy, for example. And so in those circumstances, I think there was some sudden talking up of flying saucers and UFOs to try and bury that story or spin it. But in relation to magnetism, in relation to, I mean, I haven't really followed closely the whole business of these patents and things, but I know that there's a lot of speculation about that. No, I think, I don't know, but my gut instinct is government doesn't need to bother. Somebody else will do it for them.
Well, it certainly would be to their advantage, because whoever has the anti-gravity technology, gives that government strategic military advantage. And so I would think that they would want to keep that a mystery to the rest of us.
I would agree with you completely on that. And I think one sees that certainly in Project Condign, and they did not say that in the final report, but I think it is implicit. I mean, in some of the papers that we were exchanging before the thing got commissioned, there was one very succinct comment from somebody in the defense intelligence staff who simply said, we could use this technology if it exists. And as you say, there's no getting away from the fact that the nation, or maybe I should say now, or corporation on Earth that first acquires and or understands and replicates this technology, whatever its source, will be the dominant force on this planet for the foreseeable future, politically, economically, militarily, right across the board. And I think the search, the question of technology acquisition gets to the heart of UFO secrecy much more than all the usual cliched things you hear about panic in the streets or undermining people's religious beliefs. No, I think it's technology acquisition. And if you imagine,
I agree.
If you imagine the United States, Russia, China, UK, India, Brazil, whoever, all sitting at a table, all playing poker, why would you show anyone your cards?
Exactly. Yeah, it's the world's most important secret.
Wonderful. Well, Mark, thank you. Now, let me go to Michael Richardson. Michael, your hand has been up for a while. Oops, and I think I just lost him. Okay, well, I suppose not. He kind of disappeared on me. Okay, does anyone else have any? Oh wait, there he is. Let me do ask to unmute.
Hello.
Hi, Michael, sorry about that. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, Nick, this is a very important question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I was witness to a UFO incident in the UK, which I'm sure you're familiar with one of the UFOs flying into a wind turbine, crashing into the wind turbine, and flying off with the turbine blade in the Midlands. Are you? Do you have any data on that?
I don't have any data on it. I'm familiar with the story. Now, it may be that there are a couple of such incidents, but I'm familiar of with one. I have to say I didn't think it was the Midlands. But maybe I have the location wrong. But I do remember the story ending up on the front page of the Sun newspaper under the rather amusing headline, "Close Encounters of the Turbine."
Very good. Yes. But
I don't have any data on it, I'm afraid.
Yes, we have some data on it. These 6 egg-shaped UFOs flew over my house about 6 weeks before they showed up and interacted with a wind turbine. The whole street could see these things. There is only about 400 feet up.
Right. And I forget the year of this.
It's about 10 years ago.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah,
but I believe there's a very serious message. Why would an intelligence decide to fly into a wind turbine? And I believe that is a message. But the other thing was, we noticed when they were flying over our house, they flew in a formation as the plow. And you could see the plow very bright in the sky. And you know, maybe there's a message in their interaction with us. And I think that we should have another look at that.
Well, that's very interesting. And I'm grateful to you for sharing that. I mean, of course, the last thing you mentioned, also one sees in the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So it's a very obvious way, I suppose, to signal an intelligence. I mean, as to what any of this means, I think this is one of the understudied aspects of all of this, but it's also one of the areas where we constantly run into, and how could we not, the problem of our anthropocentric approach to this. And I always, in one sense, I always smile to myself when I hear somebody say, you know, usually skeptics say, well, aliens wouldn't do that because, and then they go on, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, how would you know? And I think assigning a kind of purpose to a physical event using only the frame of reference of our own understanding is perhaps the biggest misunderstanding of all this. I know, for example, Ralph Blumenthal has a book coming out about John Mack. And John Mack, when he was talking about the abduction phenomenon, he made a very good point. He said, when people say that they recall being put on a table and having some sort of procedure, everyone says, oh, it must be a medical procedure. He said, but all we really can say is that if those recollections are accurate, and that's a big if itself, of course, it's like a medical procedure. It's the nearest thing our minds can fix on, but it may be something completely different. The same might apply. You mentioned the wind turbines. Somebody else earlier mentioned interactions with strategic assets and switching on or switching off of weaponry. You'll hear people in the UFO community say they're sending us a message or they're demonstrating their power. I think the honest answer is we don't know what they're doing.
But that is like to listen with your ears closed. You can see the message with your eyes. You can see the actions that they take. There's a serious message in all of their interactions with us. It's not just something that we take lightly. It's something that we should, you know, convey a message back to them that we are listening and we understand. But, you know, it's a very strange concept of communicating with an intelligence such as an alien intelligence.
Well, I think Dr. John Elliott at Leeds University has done some work into how one would communicate, as of course has the professor, I forget her name, who was one of the consultants on the movie Arrival. And this, of course, is, I mean, in Arrival, one of the best pieces of science fiction I think there is out there about this. The linguistic differences between, for example, conveying a tool or a weapon is very important. I once, this is completely off topic, and yet it's not. I once heard of some diplomatic talks in which the UK was involved, where the talks had kind of bogged down in the morning, and the chair of the UK delegation said, well, let's hope we have better luck after lunch. Let's go to lunch. We've got a nice restaurant lined up. Let's not talk business over dinner. The talks nearly broke down because that was perceived as an insult in the culture of the other nationality involved in those bilateral talks. It was misperceived as saying you may or may not discuss a particular topic. So if we can have these sorts of misunderstandings and miscommunications terrestrially, if we're dealing with extraterrestrials, what other miscommunications might arise? So
Absolutely.
That's why I say tread carefully in assigning meaning to this.
Now, Nick, so I want to thank you, and I worry that we're wearing you down, actually. So are you doing okay in terms of energy?
Yes,
okay.
I probably have to go in the next 10 minutes or so, which will then break it down as being an hour's talk and an hour's Q&A. Would that be fine?
Oh, absolutely. Well, no, I can't thank you enough for joining us. And actually, I think everyone else here, I would just like to put my hands together for you giving this talk. I mean, this is absolutely amazing, you know, and to see you on the news and then have you present for this group is just tremendous. But yeah, I was actually hoping to wrap the questions up. If anyone else has any more for you.
No, feel free to wrap up, but if there are a couple of late ones, I'll try and squeeze them in.
So I think we have probably one more from Robert O'Keefe, and then that's it. Okay, Robert?
Just a simple one. There's a guy on YouTube called, I think it's Damien T. Berry, The Knowledge of Forever Time. I don't know whether any of you guys have ever watched his videos, but as of an explanation about UFOs and the messages that they're trying to convey and give to us, I think that his series of videos are really compelling. I just wondered whether you'd ever seen any of Damien T. Berry's work.
I'm afraid I haven't, but thank you for mentioning that. I will certainly do my best to check that out. Thank you.
Yeah, it's called The Knowledge of Forever Time because he puts a really good argument across for the way they're communicating right the way back through the beginning of history to modern day times. But he was actually killed. He was going to release one more video and then he sort of met with an untimely end. So we never got to see the final video.
Right.
Right.
But thank you.
Robert, thank you.
A lot.
Okay. Okay. Oops.
I did see somebody else says in there that they have a question, Mark Sokol.
Yes.
Okay,
yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Quick question for Nick. How do you see disclosure coming out? By disclosure, I mean where the world generally accepts that extraterrestrials have been visiting us and flying saucers are real. How do you see that playing out? Timeline, and in which direction will it happen? Through technology or through major, government statements?
I don't think it's going to be a single event. I think many people in the UFO community think that there's going to be a sort of presidential announcement, my fellow Americans, people of the world, we're not alone. I don't think it's going to be that. I've heard some people argue with a degree of, I think, conviction here that we, in a sense, disclosure is not an event it's a process, and we're in it. And by that, they mean that some of the events of the last 3 years have undoubtedly moved the dial forward. But unless we literally do have a spaceship in a hangar somewhere, and unless one day those hangar doors are opened for all to see, I think we will be in a situation where we won't ever say, in a sense, that we've crossed the line, because everyone has their own, I suppose, level, their evidence bar, so to speak. One person's evidence is another person's definitive proof. And some people say, you know what, we're over the line already. What more do you want? And others say, well, we'll never get there, because these days anything can be faked. So I don't, unless there is a spaceship in a hangar and it's rolled out, I don't think we'll have a single event. I think the next big thing that's scheduled, I mean, of course, a lot of unscheduled things. If I can make one prediction, it will be that something unexpected will happen between now and June. But the one thing we know is coming is this report to the Intelligence Committee and the Armed Services Committee from DNI. So that's something to watch. Aside from that, though, frankly, I think the answer might come more from science than from the UFO community. In other words, I think it would be something absolutely undeniable. And of course, I like those movies like Contact, of course, one of my favorite movies. I can't help but think that if ever we get definitive, absolutely definitive proof of the existence of an extraterrestrial civilization, it's more likely to come first through radio telescopes and picking up a signal, a message, downloading information, hopefully translating it. More likely come that way than a UFO event or a disclosure. So I would say the current, but particularly the next generation of radio telescopes, square kilometer array if the thing gets built, but some others too, that will probably be how we get the answer. But I would love to be proved wrong. I would love to be proved wrong. And you know what? Whatever you think of him, I would love for the last thing President Trump does before he leaves is to say, oh, and by the way, one more thing, there's aliens.
Wonderful. Well, Nick, on that note, thank you. Thank you again. So again, I think everyone, let's put our hands together for Nick. And
Tim, I didn't finish.
Okay.
One more second. Another thing about the Drake equation that you were talking about earlier, there's one thing that I think is missing that from the Drake equation that is a pretty binary answer to whether aliens are here or not, and that is whether it is feasible to travel faster than light. Any comments on that?
Well, there are probably, I suspect that almost everyone else in this room is better placed than I to answer that. I mean, I guess light speed, one could say maybe there's a workaround, maybe some of the wormhole and warp drive things. I mean, one thing as a layperson that I do always point out is that when skeptics say this runs counter to the laws of physics, I say, well, no, what you're actually meaning to say is runs counter to the laws of physics as currently understood. And of course, throughout human history, our understanding of the laws of physics progresses and changes. And so it may well be that there are workarounds. But, with my skeptical hat on, let's just suppose there isn't a workaround. Let's just suppose that we are stuck with sublight, and one could argue, even if we don't get, set aside matter, antimatter annihilation and nuclear fission, propulsion, set aside any ideas of getting to a sort of, I don't know, 0.3, 0.4, whatever it is of light. let's suppose we don't ever get any better than we can do now. Let's suppose, and I think it's unlikely, but let's suppose kind of Voyager and Pioneer speeds are as good as it gets for anyone out there, not just us. And it would take, what, 75,000 years at that speed to get from here to Proxima Centauri. In a universe 14 billion years old, if there were civilizations out there with a few million, a billion years head start, even at Pioneer and Voyager speeds with probes, maybe the self-replicating probes that were mentioned earlier, maybe post-biological intelligence, maybe that evolves, but maybe no one can get over a Voyager or a Pioneer speed. So what? The galaxy would be full of these things by now.
Right. And one other thing I wanted to say, you mentioned SETI, or the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, using those big antennas. If you look at our own evolution, it doesn't make any sense that we would be able to contact extraterrestrials using that technology, because the type of waves that can propagate through space long distance are very large waves that carry very little information, which we no longer use. We're going from 1G to 2G to 3G, now to 5G, which are smaller and smaller waves with less and less penetration distance. So it's logical to assume that if there was other, civilizations out there, they would be going in that same direction toward the microwave band for higher bandwidth, and possibly toward what they call spooky action at a distance, or quantum entanglement. You're able to entangle two particles together that will communicate through time and space instantaneously across the entire universe. If you could have basically a walkie-talkie and talk to home base 100,000 light years away instantly.
Well, that's interesting, because of course it depends. I guess with SETI, the question is, what are other civilizations trying to do? Are they listening, or are they trying to make contact? And if anyone is trying to make contact or give us a sort of Timothy Ferris galactic internet, then one might say, even though the technology evolves, they would have knowledge to know that you need to aim the message at the listener, and at the level and type of technology that the listener would have. And that's interesting, because it plays into a wider debate, I suppose, about the nature of altruism and how widespread altruism is in the universe, and whether other civilizations would basically be taking the load themselves or making us do the work. But I think that's probably a conversation for a different day. But
Right.
yeah, it's a great point and a fascinating part of all this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, well, so let me see. I'm going to mute Mark out for just a moment. Nick, I want to thank you again so much for your time. And so let's wrap everything up for Nick now. And again, let's give him a giant hand. I know we did a minute ago, but again, thank you. It is a true honor and a pleasure for you to join us.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim, for organizing. Thank you, everyone else, for listening, whether you're listening live or later on YouTube. And I apologize because of other commitments. I am not able to live kind of follow what went before or after, but I promise I will dip into the YouTube presentations. And even though I don't have the scientific knowledge, I'm sure I will find a lot of interesting things once this is all posted up there. So thank you very much, Tim, and thank you everybody else.
Well, and thank you as well.